In the gilded ballroom of a Geneva estate, the most powerful woman in 3 continents extended her hand. Not in greeting, but in demand. The analyst looked at the unsigned report, then looked up. "I won't sign something I can't stand behind." The room went very still. What no one in that ballroom understood was this. The woman Cassandra Wolfe had just made an enemy of was the only person standing between her empire and the ground. By morning, $2.4 billion would be gone. The Meridian Gala was held every year at the Chateau Argent, a private estate outside Geneva where the air smelled of champagne and consequence. It was not a party. It was a verdict, and the world's most powerful investors came to watch it rendered. Cassandra Wolfe owned the room before she entered it. That was simply how rooms worked when she was near them. 12 years of calculated dominance had a gravitational pull. Board members straightened when she passed. Conversations adjusted their weight. Even the light in a room seemed to understand it was a backdrop. Tonight, she needed one thing. A signature. Reina Delacroix had been placed at a corner table. Close enough to be summoned, far enough to feel the hierarchy. She was 32, New Orleans raised, and wore a black dress that cost less than the centerpiece she was sitting next to. She had spent 3 weeks buried inside Wolfe Industries' financials. She had not slept well in any of them. When Cassandra crossed the ballroom toward her, the crowd parted without being asked. She stopped in front of Reina's table. The report was already there, a sleek folder, prepositioned by someone who had assumed this moment would go smoothly. Cassandra didn't sit. She let the room watch her stand. "I believe we're ready," Cassandra said. It was not a question. Reina looked at the folder. Then she looked up. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Long enough for the nearest conversations to taper off. Long enough for a photographer to turn. Long enough for the room to understand that something was happening that wasn't on the evening's program. "I won't sign something I can't stand behind." 7 words. Cassandra's smile remained in place. That precise, practiced smile that had survived hostile takeovers, congressional hearings, and 3 attempts at corporate sabotage. It did not move. But her eyes did something that no one in the room had ever seen them do before. They went cold. A man nearby laughed softly, then stopped, unsure whether it had been appropriate. Someone else reached for their champagne. The photographer lowered his camera. Cassandra leaned in, just slightly, just enough so that only Reina could hear, and said, "You understand what you're doing?" Reina met her gaze without blinking. "Yes," she said. "Do you?" Cassandra straightened. Smoothed the front of her jacket once. A motion so controlled it looked like a decision. Then she turned and walked back toward the investors who were waiting for her, and the room exhaled. By midnight, the story was already on 3 financial blogs. By 2 a.m., short sellers were stirring. By the time the sun came up over Geneva, Reina's name was on every screen, and $2.4 billion had ceased to exist. Somewhere in a Cayman-registered account, a transfer had already cleared. And in an empty hotel corridor, a woman named Sabine Holloway read the morning alerts with a small, satisfied smile, and thought, right on time. Before we get into this, if this is the kind of story you've been looking for, subscribe and hit like. It genuinely helps more people find it. Now, let's begin. Reina was still in her hotel robe when the sirens started. She had not slept. Not really. She'd lain on top of the covers in the dark, still in the clothes she'd changed out of at midnight, staring at the ceiling with the particular alertness of someone whose mind refuses to believe the day is over. The gala kept replaying. Cassandra's smile. The silence. The way the room had shifted its weight like a living thing. At 6:12 a.m., her phone began to move. Not ring. Move, buzzing continuously against the nightstand. One notification bleeding into the next before the screen could go dark. She reached for it with the slow dread of someone who already knows the news is bad and is simply delaying the confirmation. 17 missed calls. 4 from her firm. 2 from numbers she didn't recognize. 1 from her mother, which meant it had already reached the kind of people who didn't follow financial news. She opened the alerts. Breaking. Wolfe Industries reports catastrophic breach. $2.4 billion unaccounted for. Sources close to the investigation name a person of interest. She scrolled. Her own name looked strange in a headline. Smaller than she expected, and somehow more permanent. She was still reading when the knock came. 3 hard raps, the kind that don't wait for an answer. She crossed the room and opened the door to find 2 men in dark suits and a woman holding a badge she didn't give Raina time to read. Raina Delacroix. Yes. We'd like you to come with us. It wasn't a question. It was never a question when they used that tone. She asked if she could change. They said yes, but one of them stepped into the doorway to wait, which meant no, not really. She pulled on the first things her hands found. Dark trousers, a white shirt, shoes she didn't bother to tie properly. And she thought, with the cold clarity that sometimes arrives in the worst moments, about the USB drive sitting in the inner pocket of her laptop bag. She thought about it very carefully. Then she picked up the bag and walked out with them into the gray Geneva morning. The room they put her in was not a cell. That was the first thing they wanted her to understand. It had a table, 2 chairs, a jug of water nobody poured, and a wall-mounted screen that someone had already loaded before she arrived. Corporate, not government. That distinction mattered, and they made sure she felt it. This was Cassandra Wolf's machinery. The law enforcement presence was a courtesy. The real interrogation was the one about to happen in this room with these people, under fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly guilty. A man introduced himself as Harlan Voss, head of digital security for Wolf Industries. He had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had already won and was simply managing the paperwork. He clicked a remote. The screen filled with data. Access logs, transaction chains, IP addresses highlighted in red. Clean columns of numbers with her name threaded through them like a stitch. She recognized the architecture of Wolf's internal systems immediately. She had spent 3 weeks inside them. Which, she understood now, was exactly the point. At 11:47 p.m., Voss said, a credentialed user accessed the primary transfer interface using your assigned analyst login. 17 transactions were initiated over the course of 41 minutes. He clicked again. The originating IP resolves to a private router registered to your firm's Geneva account. The authentication tokens match your session credentials. The behavioral signature, keystrokes, navigation pattern, query sequence, is consistent with your usage profile from the 3 weeks prior. He set the remote down. Ms. Delacroix, I've done this for 16 years. This is the most complete forensic picture I have ever seen. Raina looked at the screen for a long moment. She looked at the timestamps. She looked at the transaction routing, the account numbers, the clean, elegant chain of evidence that led, without deviation or ambiguity, directly to her. It was perfect. That was the problem. In her experience, real mistakes were messy. Real theft left friction, hesitation in the data, irregular timing, the small human errors that no one thinks to clean up because they're busy panicking. This had none of that. Someone had built this. Carefully. Lovingly, almost. She folded her hands on the table and said nothing. They couldn't hold her. Not yet. The evidence was damning, but the jurisdiction was complicated. Swiss law, corporate versus criminal thresholds, the fine line between person of interest and formal suspect. Her firm's legal contact, a tired man named Edouard who sounded like she had woken him, told her over the phone to say nothing further and go nowhere obvious. She asked him what nowhere obvious meant in practical terms. He paused. Not your hotel, he said. They'll have someone in the lobby by now. He was right. She walked past the entrance and kept walking. She found a room at a place that took cash, 3 tram stops from the lake, the kind of establishment that didn't ask questions because its entire business model depended on not asking questions. The mattress was thin and the radiator knocked, but there was a desk, a chair, and a door that locked from the inside, which was all she needed. She opened her laptop bag and found the USB drive exactly where she'd left it, tucked inside the inner lining behind her spare charging cable. She had put it there 10 days ago, on a Tuesday evening, working late in an empty conference room on the 14th floor of Wolf's Geneva office. She hadn't copied the files to expose anyone. She had copied them because something in the numbers felt wrong in a way she couldn't yet name, and she was the kind of person who trusted that feeling. She plugged it in. The files opened slowly, Raw audit data, internal transfer logs, entity mapping documents, the sprawling, unglamorous infrastructure of a $9 billion empire. She had read all of it before, but she had read it looking for irregularities to flag. Now she was reading it looking for something different. She was looking for the architecture of a setup. She started with the shell companies. There were 11 flagged in her original review. Minor, explainable on the surface, the kind of offshore layering that was legal in the way that many things are technically legal. She pulled the transaction timings. She pulled the account registration dates. She cross-referenced the jurisdictions. And there, quiet as a hairline fracture in glass, she found the first thread. She pulled it. Cassandra had not slept either, but for different reasons. Raina Delacroix had not slept because she was afraid. Cassandra did not sleep because she was thinking, and when Cassandra Wolf was thinking at full capacity, sleep was simply an inefficiency she couldn't afford. She sat at the desk in her penthouse suite with 3 laptops open and a cold cup of coffee she kept forgetting to drink, and she read the forensic report for the 4th time. It was perfect. She set it down. In 12 years of building an empire, Cassandra had been betrayed 4 times. She knew what betrayal looked like in the data. It looked like greed, irregular, accelerating, the kind of pattern that started small and got bolder as confidence grew. It looked like someone who had been watching and waiting and finally decided the risk was worth the reward. It did not look like this. What Harlan had presented her was a surgical strike. 1 night, 1 window, 41 minutes, clean entry and cleaner exit. No hesitation. No redundancy. No loose ends except the ones that were supposed to be found. The forensics weren't evidence of a crime. They were a performance of one. And performances, in Cassandra's experience, required rehearsal. They required inside knowledge. They required someone who understood not just how the systems worked but how the investigation would work afterward. Raina Delacroix had been inside Wolf Industries for 3 weeks. Whoever built this had been inside much longer. She pulled up the internal access logs herself, not Harlan's summary, the raw data, and started running her own query. She was not a forensic analyst, but she had built these systems from the ground up, and she knew their architecture the way you know the layout of a house you've lived in for a decade. In the dark, by memory, without thinking. She found the anomaly at 4 a.m. A secondary access thread, thin as a whisper, that predated Raina's involvement by 7 months. It had been routed through a credentialed internal account. Someone with clearance so deep it wouldn't have triggered a flag unless you were looking for it specifically. She looked at the account ID for a long time. Then she closed the laptop, slowly, and sat very still in the dark. The message came through an encrypted channel Raina didn't recognize, routed to a secondary email she had used only once, during her initial onboarding at Wolf Industries, for a single administrative form. Whoever sent it had dug for that address. That alone told her something. Parking level B3. Chateau Frontenac Annex. 2 a.m. Come alone. I have the same anomaly you do. No name. No explanation. She told herself she wasn't going. Then she checked the USB drive data again, looked at the thread she'd been pulling for 6 hours, and understood that wherever it led, she couldn't follow it alone. She needed someone with access to the internal server logs she couldn't reach from a cheap hotel room on a borrowed connection. She went. Level B3 was the kind of place that existed in every expensive building and looked exactly the same in all of them. Concrete pillars, yellow light, the smell of oil and cold air. Her footsteps were too loud. She slowed them down deliberately. Cassandra Wolf was already there, leaning against a black car with her arms crossed and her coat pulled tight, looking like a woman who had never stood in a parking garage in her life and was furious about it. They stared at each other across 10 feet of concrete. You came, Cassandra said. So did you, Raina replied. Neither of them moved for a moment. The history of the last 48 hours sat between them like a third person. The gala, the headlines, the interrogation room, Raina's name in every alert on Cassandra's phone. Cassandra spoke first. The forensics are fabricated. I know, Raina said. I built the original audit trail. What was presented to me this morning wasn't messy enough to be real. There's a secondary access thread in my internal logs. 7 months old. Credentialed. Deep clearance. Cassandra paused. It doesn't belong to anyone on my security team. Reyna opened her laptop. I found something similar in the shell company registrations. Look at the timing on these account activations. Cassandra looked. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one at the gala. That one had been about power. This one was about the cold, dawning recognition that they had both been maneuvered, precisely, patiently, by someone who knew them well enough to use them against each other. Someone built this around us, Reyna said quietly. Cassandra's jaw tightened. Someone who knew exactly how I'd respond to being embarrassed in public. Their eyes met. Who placed you at the gala? Cassandra asked. Reyna didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The answer was already moving through both of them like a current, slow and inevitable. There was only one name that fit every edge of this. They worked through the night in the back seat of Cassandra's car, the windows fogging slowly with the heat of two laptops running simultaneously. It was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. It was the kind of collaboration that happens only when two people have run out of every other option and the only thing left is the truth. Reyna worked the shell company thread. Cassandra worked the internal access logs. They didn't speak much, just the occasional terse exchange when something needed cross-referencing, the kind of communication that strips away everything except the problem. At 3:40 a.m., Reyna found the parent entity. It was buried 4 layers deep, 3 jurisdictional transfers, 2 nominee directors, and a holding structure registered in the Cayman Islands 18 months ago under a name that meant nothing. Harlow Meridian Group. She almost passed it. Then she pulled the biometric account access records that Cassandra had quietly extracted from Wolf's private banking portal, and she ran the authorization signatures against the name. They matched a single user profile. She turned the screen toward Cassandra without saying anything. Cassandra looked at it for a long time. Longer than she needed to, because she already knew what she was reading. She had known, in some unexamined part of herself, since she'd closed her laptop at 4 a.m. and sat in the dark. She had simply been waiting for the data to confirm what her instincts had already decided. Sabine Holloway. Her oldest friend. Her chief strategy officer. The woman who had sat beside her at every board meeting, every crisis, every quiet dinner where they'd rebuilt strategy from scratch after a bad quarter. The woman who had always been there. Who had always been watching. She built this company with me, Cassandra said. Her voice was even. That was the most frightening thing about it. She built it, Reyna said carefully, and decided she wasn't getting enough credit for it. Cassandra set the laptop on the seat between them and looked out through the fogged window at nothing. She hired you specifically. She knew I wouldn't sign. She needed the distraction. She needed the chaos. Cassandra's voice dropped. So no one would notice the money moving. The yellow garage light hummed above them. 18 months of planning. Executed in 41 minutes. And the only thing Sabine hadn't accounted for was that the 2 women she'd positioned as enemies would end up in the same parking garage, reading the same data, at 3 a.m. They had one advantage. Sabine didn't know they were talking. Everything she had built depended on a specific sequence. Reyna buried under suspicion, Cassandra consumed by fury, both of them looking at each other while Sabine moved quietly in the opposite direction. As long as that sequence held, she was invisible. The moment it broke, the entire architecture of her plan became a liability. Every careful move she had made left a trail. She had simply counted on no one being in a position to follow it. Reyna understood this at 4 a.m., staring at the Harlow Meridian Group registration, and said so out loud. She's not done moving the money, she said. The Cayman account is a waypoint, not a destination. She'll route it again, probably within 48 hours, to fragment the trail before it can be traced. Cassandra was already thinking the same thing. So we need her to move it somewhere we control. We need her to think she's still winning, Reyna said. Which means she needs to think I'm still the suspect, you're still the victim, and nobody has connected the Harlow entity to her name. She pulled up the internal reporting interface she still had ghost access to, a secondary analyst credential that hadn't been revoked in the chaos of the investigation, an oversight that felt right now like luck. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Cassandra. "I can push a false compliance report through the audit channel. Something that makes it look like the forensic investigation is closing in on a dead end. A decoy account in Luxembourg that doesn't exist. If Sabine is monitoring the investigation, she'll see it. And if she believes the heat is moving away from her real routing path, she'll accelerate the final transfer." "And if she accelerates," Cassandra said quietly, "she moves the money before she's ready." "Before she's ready," Reyna confirmed. "Into an account structure I'll have already flagged with the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority as a monitoring target." A honeypot. Invisible until the moment it wasn't. Cassandra studied her for a moment with an expression Reyna couldn't fully read. Something between assessment and something that might, in different circumstances, have been respect. "Do it," she said. Reyna started typing. The alert came at 6:47 a.m. Reyna's monitoring flag had triggered. The honeypot account had received an inbound transfer instruction. $2.4 billion, routed through a Cayman bridge clearance with a 40-minute settlement window. 40 minutes before the funds fragmented into a dozen downstream accounts across 4 jurisdictions and became, for all practical purposes, untouchable. She called out to Cassandra from across the hotel room they had moved to at 5 a.m., somewhere neutral, somewhere with better Wi-Fi and fewer concrete pillars. Cassandra was on the phone before Reyna finished the sentence. The next 10 minutes were controlled chaos, the kind that looks like panic from the outside and operates like a machine from the inside. Cassandra reached her private legal team, then a direct contact at the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority, then a number she dialed without looking it up that Reyna understood, without asking, belonged to someone very senior in a government office that didn't advertise its involvement in financial crime. Her voice throughout was flat and precise, the way it got when emotion became inefficient. She gave names, account numbers, the Harlow Meridian registration details, the biometric access signatures. She gave everything in under 4 minutes and hung up. "They need the airport," Reyna said, already pulling flight records through the Wolf Industries travel system. Another credential still live, another overlooked thread. If she's moving the money now, she's leaving now. She wouldn't stay in the country once the transfer clears. It took her 6 minutes to find it. A private charter, filed under a subsidiary name Reyna recognized from the shell company structure. Departing Geneva International at 7:43 a.m. 53 minutes from the moment the alert had triggered. Cassandra was already moving toward the door, code in hand, phone back at her ear. "I have the tail number," she said into it. "Ground it." Reyna grabbed the USB drive, the laptop, and followed. The drive to the airport took 19 minutes. They didn't speak. The city moved past the windows in the gray early light, Geneva waking up slowly, unhurried, indifferent to the fact that somewhere in its airport a woman was sitting in a private departure lounge, watching a transfer progress bar, believing she had won. She had 31 minutes left to keep believing it. They reached the airport at 7:31 a.m. Sabine was in the private departures lounge on the upper level, seated near the window with a carry-on bag at her feet and a coffee she wasn't drinking. She was dressed for travel the way she dressed for everything. Precisely, intentionally, as though the occasion had been planned well in advance. Which, of course, it had. She looked up when the doors opened. Her eyes found Cassandra first, then moved to Reyna, and in the half-second before her expression closed, something moved across her face that was not quite surprise. It was the look of someone who had run an almost perfect play and was now doing the quiet mathematics of where it had unraveled. She didn't run. That, at least, was dignified. The FINMA officers came in behind them. The process was brief and efficient and very public, because private departures lounges have glass walls and the people in them have phones. By the time Sabine was escorted through the door, 3 cameras had already captured it. By the time her charter was grounded on the tarmac, the transfer had been frozen mid-settlement, the Cayman Bridge suspended on regulatory hold, and all $2.4 billion sat in a monitored escrow that belonged, for the moment, to no one. Reyna stood at the window and watched the tarmac. She felt, more than anything, tired. The formal exoneration came 4 days later, a quiet document, precise and unambiguous, that cleared her name across every jurisdiction that had carried it. Her firm reinstated her. 2 others called to offer her positions. The financial press, which had spent a week constructing a villain out of her, spent the next week constructing a different kind of story. She didn't read either version. Cassandra called on a Thursday evening, 10 days after the gala. No assistant. No preamble. Just her voice, direct as always, stripped of its usual architecture. "You could have signed it," she said. "It would have been easier." "I know," Raina said. A pause. Longer than Cassandra Wolfe typically allowed silences to run. "Thank you," she said, "for not taking the easier thing." She hung up before Raina could answer. Which was, Raina thought, exactly what she would have expected. And somehow, precisely enough. And that's where we leave them. Two women who were never supposed to trust each other. One conspiracy built on the assumption that integrity could be weaponized against the person who had it. And a thank you that took 10 days, one phone call and everything, to finally say, "If this story stayed with you, subscribe." It costs you nothing, and it means everything for stories like this one to keep finding the people who need them. Leave a like if Raina earned it. And drop a comment. I genuinely read them. Tell me whose side you were on at the gala. Tell me when you knew it was Sabine. Tell me what you want to see next. I'll be here.